Welcome to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. Legal issues simplified through real client stories and real-world experiences. Creating simplicity in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd.
As a business and healthcare law firm, we meet a lot of interesting people and learn their amazing stories. This season, we are riding the emotional roller coaster of the different types of crises that can arise in the operating season of a business. Our theme, Brad, is running a business.
Now, Michael, as we've said in other shows so far this year, that's just one season. What are all the seasons?
We have the building season, starting a business, the operating season. Next season in our podcast, we'll be talking about the scaling season, growing a business, and then the buying and selling season.
Perfect. Well done, sir. Now, Michael, before we get started with today's story, I'm going to pivot from our little mini stories we've been doing all season, and I want to bring our long-standing tradition of discussing TV shows that we love on our show.
No.
What if it has to do with Breaking Bad references?
Okay, that's not fair. You know that I'm a fan of Breaking Bad, and that I even love the sister show, Better Call Saul, even more.
Now, Michael, since you are a resident expert on both shows, can you give a super brief description for those that have no idea what we're talking about these two shows?
I'll start with my favorite first, Brad. Better Call Saul is a TV show about an attorney named Jimmy McGill, who is trying to find his way as an attorney under the big shadow cast by his famous brother, Chuck McGill. There was a tension with Jimmy of being a hustler growing up and then also wanting to do good. And eventually, throughout the show, he ended up changing his name to Saul Goodman, which played a part when you've seen Breaking Bad. And we learned about this journey of him as an attorney, ultimately representing Walter White and other criminals in Albuquerque. Now, Breaking Bad is a TV show that actually was before Better Call Saul, about a science teacher named Walter White, who turns to the criminal world to help repay for his cancer treatments.
Right.
He made meth, Brad.
Yeah, he did. Now, right, and we did a whole show called MSO Breaking Bad, and we actually went into a little more details back then.
We've been really drug heavy with our conversations this season for some reason. Where are you going with this?
Well, what if I told you that being a scientist doesn't always make you smarter?
Kind of like you being an attorney does not make you smarter?
Ouch. Hey, Kennedy, can you just make sure that gets cut? That's just mean right there. But Well, I read an article recently where art became life. In Long Island, New York, a gentleman who wanted to be like Walter White, apparently, he was really good at science, getting that science down, but apparently was not very intelligent.
I don't want to play spoilers here, but did he blow himself up?
You know what? Sort of. He called the cops about an alleged break-in at his business, the Quantive Laboratories, LLC.
Whoa, creative name for a lab, for a scientist?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, when the police arrived for this break-in, it was really hard for them to simply just investigate the broken glass outside because they couldn't ignore the mounds of drugs inside.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes. Ultimately, the police found over 100 pieces of lab equipment, $40K in cash, meth-producing chemicals, array of drugs, including GHB, meth, and ketamine.
Was there any word of an RV parked outside?
Good Breaking Bad reference. No mention of an RV.
Okay, I cannot believe that you sucked me in and got me to discuss TV shows again. We were doing so well this year, but let's get to it, Brad. Let's get to our story today. Hopefully there's no RVs or mounds of drugs that we're talking about.
Well, I don't think there are, but we'll get in today's story. So our first character is a doctor named Dr. Pinkman.
Okay, audience members who don't know, Brad is now bringing Breaking Bad characters into our main story. Jesse Pinkman is Walter White's former student who was not the sharpest tool in the shed.
No, he wasn't.
But he partnered with Walter White to build a drug empire. I'm also objecting, Brad, as you're using names of characters that we used in that prior show, MSO Breaking Bad. Seems really lazy to me. But I guess go on.
Well, I figure I could get away with it only for the fact because you love Breaking Bad so much.
Fair.
Maybe it was lazy of me. All right, back to Dr. Pinkman worked for the Heisenberg Healthcare Company in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and it was initially formed by Dr. White, Dr. Hank Schrader, and Dr. Schuyler White. Now, Hank was Walter's brother-in-law, and Schuyler was his wife. So Dr. Pinkman was the only owner who was not related to the founders of the organization.
So all of these characters are from Breaking Bad. You're going deep with Breaking Bad today. I'm just at this point, I'm going to roll with it, but I'm starting to get an ominous feel about our story today.
That's probably a good sign there that you're catching on. Now, Dr. Pinkman has been working at the organization for years, and has been an owner for about 5 years. Dr. Pinkman makes a lot of money for Heisenberg Healthcare Company, but he was always complaining that he was not paid enough.
Okay, well, I'm curious now. Is it just these 4 physicians that you've mentioned?
Actually, no. It's a good question, Michael. Actually, there's a bunch of employed physicians. They had mid-levels who worked there and in the practice, and they had locations all across the state.
Okay, you use the term mid-levels, Brad. For those not familiar with the term, that generally is meaning physician assistants and nurse practitioners, PAs and NPs. These are professionals who, like physicians, can assist with the diagnosis and treatment plan and help and treat patients based on proper supervision.
Great. Good catch there, Michael. And they had a large support staff to complement all these providers. Dr. Pinkman was growing his practice and quickly became one of the number one providers, if not the number one provider. But he still never felt like he got paid enough.
Well, how did they compensate Dr. Pinkman?
All right, so all the physician owners were paid based on their personal production and, of course, the ancillary revenue. Each physician had an employment agreement that paid them on their personal production under what we call an eat what you kill model. And as it relates to the ancillary revenue they had a lab, they had an MRI, they had X-ray machines. These physicians owners received distributions of the profits of Heisenberg Healthcare based on their pro rata share of ownership.
Okay, that's a lot to unpack, Brad. Let me first talk about this eat what you kill model that you referenced. So let me start with what it's not, so everybody has the context. So a lot of times with physician employees and even partners, their comp system will be a base salary, and particularly with employees, they may have incentive comp that kicks in when they reach a level of production. An eat what you kill model almost feels like you're your own little business, in the sense that you track the revenues that you produce as in this case, partner, and then you get allocated certain expenses, and there's a bunch that goes into that. But ultimately, you eat what you kill. You get to keep what's left over after you paid whatever has been agreed upon. But you mentioned another term. You mentioned ancillary revenues, and I know that unless we happen to have some healthcare attorneys out there, that may have just kind of been glossed over. Talk a little bit about ancillary revenues and why these were distributed, you said, on a pro rata share of ownership.
Yeah, and ancillary revenues will often be that's not based on their personal production. So that could be based on, again, MRIs or X-rays and labs, things in which a doctor is referring to someone else to take care of that. Now, because a doctor themselves not taking care of it, there's a bunch of rules that you have to abide by, especially when you have federal payers, which in this particular practice was involved. And these federal payers could be Medicare or Medicaid or TRICARE or other federally funded programs. And when it comes to these programs, just because I refer the most doesn't mean I get paid the most. There's certain federal laws out there. Some of you might have heard of Stark. Well, that's the federal anti-referral law. Or I'm sorry, that's the federal. That's the federal anti-referral law. There's another law out there called the federal anti-kickback law, which is another law that really prohibits people getting kickbacks for referrals. And both of these, both the Stark and anti-kickback law, have certain exemptions that you can use. In Stark, we call them Stark exceptions. In the anti-kickback world, we call them safe harbors. And when it comes to these types of practices, there's ways to legally build these ownerships and allow them to receive funds from it. But mostly, the easiest way to summarize it all, it has to be generally based on your pro rata share of ownership, and that's why they couldn't just receive whatever they referred.
Okay. Sorry for the sidebar there. Let's get back to our story. So I am surprised that Dr. Pinkman was complaining how he was paid. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. He's on an eat what you kill model, which rewards you the most for your own production. I mean, it seems like those who produce the most get paid the most at Heisenberg Healthcare.
Yeah, Michael, that's correct. But Dr. Pinkman always felt like he was owed more money, and it started to appear that he started not trusting the fact that all these other owners were related.
Okay, did Dr. Pinkman have access to the financial records?
Yes, the group and not only they had quarterly board meetings, annual shareholder meetings. Additionally, they produced monthly reports showing the production of each physician, mid-level, all the revenue for the ancillaries. But even with all this information, Dr. Pinkman was complaining that he was underpaid.
A lot's not making sense here, Brad. And this is the operating season, so I'm starting to get the picture that we had a crisis.
Your assumption is correct.
Okay.
As one of the employed physicians had been a disaster for Heisenberg Healthcare, and we'll just call him Dr. Gus Fring.
Okay, another character from Breaking Bad, and he was a scary character. He was bad. Why was Dr. Gus Fring from our story today an issue?
Yeah, good question. He kept failing to complete his medical records timely. He failed to complete the billing for the medical practice that they needed to bill for him, and he generally just seemed disorganized.
Well, he's definitely not a drug lord and murderer like on the show.
No.
So that's the good news.
It's good point.
Yes. Did Heisenberg Healthcare believe that patient care was also an issue?
No, actually, Dr. Gus Fring, he was loved by his patients and delivered great care, but just he didn't get to his bills and didn't get to his charts and didn't timely go through the stuff that the practice needed to do so it could get paid.
Yeah, we've had a few doctors over the years that just didn't seem to be wired to handle these administrative responsibilities.
Mm-hmm.
They come and typically have this mindset that they're doctors. The most important thing is to do proper care for the patients, which is the most important thing.
Correct.
However, this is unfortunately a massive problem on both the business side and the compliance side.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think from a compliance perspective, you're required to keep updated medical records. And so, if whether you're working for a practice or on your own or a part of a hospital system, it's really important. And you create risk not complying with medical board requirements on keeping that. Now, from a business perspective, it's pretty straightforward, Brad. If you don't bill, you don't get paid.
Wow. That is great points there about business side of healthcare. Wait, Kennedy, just strike that from the podcast. We can't make Michael look that good. All right, back to our story. Over the last few months at Heisenberg Healthcare, they would have these board meetings and they would discuss Dr. Gus Fring about he was losing money and what corrective action should they take to remedy the situation. But basically, after 18 months, nothing seemed to be working. So they just finally decided just to fire Gus and because they couldn't get him to complete his administrative side of the practice, it just wasn't working.
I'm sure it was a hard decision if he was beloved by the patients, but necessary for the practice. What does Dr. Gus Fring have to do with Dr. Pinkman?
Everything.
Oh.
Gus was a major drain on the profitability of this practice, so much that it ate into a substantial portion of their profits, as they were, first off, overpaying Gus and then not billing for him, which led to a very upside down on the Gus's revenue. And additionally, Gus heavily used mid-levels to help cater to his patients, which added to the overall expenses to the practice.
So if I'm hearing this right, Gus had a very high salary. He was paid a lot.
Yes.
He had very low revenues because he wouldn't bill for his work. He had a lot of people helping him.
Yep.
And they got paid a lot.
Yep.
And there was no revenues coming in from them either. Yeah, that's not a good equation for the business.
It's not.
And I would say this, for an owner of the practice, they're assuming the risk of employees. I mean, the flip side is they get to share in the upside in the profitability. Going back to your ancillary revenue, there can be other employed providers that create, a lot of profit for a practice. But this sounds like the wrong kind of force multiplier.
Exactly. As such, at the end of the year, everyone's distributions was impacted. Dr. Pinkman was furious, and he only wanted the founders to actually bear the burden of this financial impact.
And so just to restate, the founders being the family partners, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so why did he think these founders should bear this burden?
Well, Dr. Pinkman believed since Dr. White was the CEO and did not fire Gus fast enough, and everyone else was related to Dr. White, Dr. Pinkman should not have to suffer the poor decision-making of running this business, and all the other partners should have to split the loss between themselves.
I'm confused, Brad. I thought you said Dr. Pinkman was on the board and had access to all the same information.
Yeah, you were listening well. Good job. It apparently didn't matter to him.
Well, did Dr. Pinkman ever object to them keeping Gus during one of these board meetings?
No, there's no evidence of that. And additionally, Dr. Pinkman felt like the practice was also underpaying him on his personal collections, as Dr. Pinkman started to argue that he should receive 100% of the collections he worked and not have to share any of it to help cover his expenses.
Well, as I explained earlier in an Eat What You Kill model, a doctor does not get to take home everything a doctor collects. They have to cover their expenses.
Yeah.
So what made Dr. Pinkman think he deserved all of his collections?
You'll love this answer. Because it was unfair that he was working this hard and didn't get all of this money.
The no fair excuse.
Mm-hmm.
With 5 kids, I'm very well versed on this excuse. Of course, this is when they were little kids, not so much grown adults working.
Right.
And as you've heard me say many times in response to that, the fair only happens once a year in Texas. It's in September.
Yeah.
So definitely see the crisis bubbling. What happened?
Well, clearly the parties didn't have alignment as it relates to how to deal with this loss, and unfortunately it boiled over into the courtroom as Dr. Pinkman ended up suing Heisenberg Healthcare for breach of contract and all his partners for breach of their fiduciary duty to him as a shareholder.
I think a lawsuit qualifies as a crisis.
Yes.
Okay. Well, let's go into a commercial and on the other side, talk about how we responded to these threats.
Many business owners use legal counsel as a last resort rather than as a proactive tool that can further their success. Why? For most, it's the fear of unknown legal costs. ByrdAdatto's Access Plus program makes it possible for you to get the ongoing legal assistance you need for one predictable monthly fee. That gives you unlimited phone and email access to the legal team, so you can receive feedback on legal concerns as they arise. Access Plus, a smarter, simpler way to access legal services. Find out more. Visit ByrdAdatto.com today.
Well, welcome back to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd. Now, Michael, this season, our theme is running a business. And we're talking about real client problems that pop up during the operating season of a business. Now, Michael, we just talked about how to respond to litigation on other shows earlier this season. So let's first kind of double-click and outline, how does ownership typically work?
This is important because we saw a definite disconnect on expectations from, our hero, or maybe he's not our hero in the story, but the problem with Dr. Pinkman.
Right.
So the first concept to ownership is so basic, but you have to understand that you're taking a risk.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
I'm out. Wait. I'm leaving right now. I have to take a risk as an owner?
We're many years into this, Brad.
Oh.
So, you've been taking a risk for a long time.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
Thank you for letting me know.
If there's not enough money to pay the bills and you're an owner, you don't get paid.
This is worse than I ever thought.
I know. I'm glad you're getting educated while we're educating our audience, Brad. And we see this sometimes, Brad, especially in the medical practice scenario, where owners have an employee mindset.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's I do this, I deserve this, I'm entitled to this, I'm entitled to 100% of my collections. They think that they should be paid based on their work. As I said, they're entitled. But the reality is that the owners, and I've mentioned this already, they enjoy both the fruit of the profits of the practice, but they're also the last to get fed, figuratively, when losing money.
Yeah.
Or in an Eat What You Kill, you get to eat last.
Yeah.
And so when it comes to profits, these are most commonly distributed according to the percentage of ownership. And so what you might have seen here, or probably did see, you can confirm, is, you get this Eat What You Kill model that covers your own personal production, but there's all these ancillary revenues, which include the other employees that generate profits, and you get distributions, like you mentioned earlier, according to ownership. And so, depending on the type of entity and maybe even the model of the practice, you'll sometimes see that profits are distributed based on some factor other than ownership. But as we know here, there was actual compliance reasons that they were doing it, according to ownership. But Brad, this is one aspect of being a partner or shareholder for a medical practice.
Yeah.
Talk about kind of the management side. How is a practice managed?
Yeah, and so audience members, as you can imagine, you can be an owner of a business, and that doesn't mean that you're actually doing the governance. So a lot of times your owners will appoint people called board of directors or even officers. Now, those individuals, your board members and your officers, they serve at the pleasure of the board serves at the pleasure of the shareholders in this case, and the board members appoint officers who serve at the pleasure of the board. So they all talk to each other. And these individuals are the ones that should be helping making the business decisions and the advancement. That doesn't mean they're doing the day-to-day grind of, doing the checkbooks, but they're making sure they have the right person to do that. They're helping implement the vision and the strategy related to running that business. And they're making sure that they're doing good governance throughout that process. Now, Michael, as part of the lawsuit, Dr. Pinkman claimed that these other directors breached their fiduciary duty. So I think we need to jump into that vocabulary word. What is a fiduciary duty?
Okay, I feel trapped, audience. I don't know how to answer this question without getting into the legal a little bit here.
Yeah.
So just, I guess this is a legal podcast.
Yes,
so
it is a legal podcast.
I do have some wiggle room.
It's called the legal 1, 2, 3.
Okay. Well, so that means I have to simplify somehow.
Yes, sir.
Something that's not simple. Fiduciary duty refers to basically a relationship between someone that's deemed to be a fiduciary and the beneficiary on whose behalf the fiduciary acts.
Mm-hmm.
So the fiduciary accepts a legal responsibility, and they have these duties of care, duty of loyalty, good faith, confidentialities, and more when there's to serve in the best interests of a beneficiary. And of course, maybe not of course, a board member, a director, and an officer, that part of that role carries this responsibility, this fiduciary responsibility. And so what I've learned is that one of the arguments in the lawsuit by Dr. Pinkman was that the other family members, as officers or directors, that they breached their fiduciary duty of loyalty to the owners, and that they didn't act in their best interest. And so I want to pause for a minute, Brad, because that's what the allegation in the lawsuit was. It's important to understand that fiduciary duty is a state law-driven doctrine.
Yeah.
And I'm going to try to keep us out of the weeds, but there are nuances, as to whether a director in a corporation owes this fiduciary duty to the shareholder or they owe the fiduciary duty to the corporation itself.
Right.
And it does matter in a lawsuit depending on how the state law is written. And also, common medical practices are set up as partnerships as the legal entity.
Right.
And there it's more straightforward. A partner owes this fiduciary duty to the other partners.
Right.
So, Brad, talk a little bit about the ways the board can act for the benefit of the owners as good fiduciaries.
Yeah, and on that point, audience members, to Michael's point about the fiduciary piece, first off, is that someone can sue you for everything, but to Michael's point, that doesn't mean it's actually a true fiduciary duty that's owed. But for those that do, let's talk about if the entire board does have a fiduciary duty, what are the things they can think about to make sure they're acting like that? So they should monitor the business by discussing and analyzing financial reports. They should be paying attention to the funding and expenditures and the revenues and debts and cash flow. And with this information, the board should exercise what they call the good faith judgment as it relates to the appropriate oversight needed for running this particular business. And if the board is active in following what it believes to be the best course of the business, it's acting for the benefit of these owners of the business. And as such, if they make a bad business decision, it hurts, right? But that they should be liable as a board or as officers for making a bad business decision. and therefore they shouldn't be a breach of their fiduciary or their obligation to the owners just because they made a bobo there, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, there's a long-standing doctrine. It's called the business judgment rule, that it basically protects a fiduciary, a board member, an officer, from honest mistakes and for good faith decisions based on their business judgment.
Mm-hmm.
So, making a mistake is not a breach of a fiduciary duty. Now, what's interesting, and you mentioned this earlier, you said if you're active. Well, an inactive board, which we see that in practices, boards that don't meet, you can't oftentimes in states hide behind the business judgment rule if you're doing nothing.
Right.
And so activity does matter. And so in today's story, Heisenberg Healthcare it's providing these monthly reports, and you've mentioned several times they were active. So why, I'm curious, didn't Dr. Peakman raise his concerns at these board meetings?
Yeah, it's a great question, because what we eventually learned is he actually didn't understand how P&L worked at the practice, even though he had been an owner for 5 years.
And unfortunately, this is also more common than you would think. And that's, curious. He might be the one risking his breach of fiduciary duty, but protected by the business judgment rule.
Mm-hmm.
But a P&L at its most high level is...
What does P&L mean?
Profit and loss statement.
Good. Thank you. I didn't know.
Yeah. And, well, you're learning a lot today, Brad.
This is so good.
This is so helpful
Very
for
helpful.
our partnership.
I'm taking notes.
Yeah. So the P&L basically tracks the money in and the money out.
Mm-hmm.
Revenues that come in from a global perspective,
right,
from all sources, all the revenues, and then all sources of expenses down to you get to the profit, the leftover. The net income is the number, the term you'll see from an accounting perspective. And so that's kind of the gist of the P&L.
Yeah, you're right. The profit being better than the losses, right?
Yes, I've heard that's good.
Good. Okay, good. I'm doing great now. Yeah. And so as the losses started adding up, Dr. Peakman actually didn't understand the overall impact that Dr. Gus Fring was really having on their practice, which caused this ripple effect that Dr. Peakman thought the owners must be stealing from him, and therefore Dr. Peakman was owed more money, again, including 100% of his collections. And Michael, let's take a little step back here. But Michael, we talk about this a lot, about how collections really work in a medical practice. Maybe you can discuss that.
Let's double click on the eat what you kill that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
So kind of think of a subcategory of a P&L where we're just isolating on Dr. Peakman in this example, just to have someone to picture. Yeah. And when we talk about collections, a eat what you kill model actually has his revenues minus his expenses. Well, his revenues are going to be collections that come in the door based on work off his back. And so oftentimes the other sources of revenue wouldn't be isolated on this kind of single sheet of a kind of Peakman, P&L.
Right. And these collections, you remember, audience member, is from what's collected, not billed, and not have to do with any of the other ancillary revenue, purely that. Now, Michael, you did mention, since this story is talking about eat what you kill, one of the important elements of an eat what you kill is first the collections, but how the overhead actually impacts then the model and much less the collections themselves. Can you talk about that?
If I stopped right where we were, then Dr. Peakman would be great.
Yes.
He wants 100% of all the money he collects. So
right.
He wants to stop at that top line on his individual sheet.
Right.
The problem is that, again, there are expenses associated with that. And when you do an eat what you kill, you're allocating those expenses. And so there might be direct expenses like any salary that he's taking or malpractice insurance for him or other direct expenses. And then there's shared overhead that may be his portion of the rent that's maybe done according to ownership or per person.
Right.
And then there might be indirect things like per use, like if he's using more, gauze in his procedures or other supplies, then you got to figure out a way to allocate that. And they would have, I'm sure, pre-agreed to this, and that's how the overhead side works.
Well done. It's almost like you've talked about this before. So to summarize for our audience, Dr. Peakman did not want to share as an owner when it comes to the losses of the business, and for every dollar that he collected on his behalf, Dr. Peakman wanted his share. He did not want to share with his partners his revenue.
Oh, man. So what happened with Dr. Peakman in his lawsuit against Heisenberg Healthcare?
Well, we went on to an all-day mediation, at which point we finally had some alignment as Dr. Peatman's litigation attorney actually brought a corporate attorney and a CPA to the mediation. The mediator seemed to indicate that the team was able to shed some light to everyone in the room as to how these matters started to work, and we were able to settle the matter.
So is Dr. Peatman still with the practice?
No, as part of the settlement, the parties did separate, and Dr. Peatman left to go start his own practice.
Wow. I hope he figured out P&Ls, Brad, and how to properly compensate himself, because it's not going to go good if he's keeping 100% of what comes in.
Yeah, I don't think it worked well for him since he's no longer at that practice that he started and is now employed by a hospital.
Just where he belongs. Okay, Brad, let's wrap it up. When you named these characters today after Breaking Bad, I was expecting the crisis to involve a meth lab or some level of criminal activity. So I guess I'm relieved that this was just a story of bad business.
Yeah.
But even bad businesses can lead to a major crisis, costing hundreds of thousands of dollars in losses and fighting over unmet expectations.
Correct, you are, Michael. Guess what, Michael? Next Wednesday, we will be back and address a crisis when a client gets a cease and desist letter on their trademark. Thanks again for joining us today. And remember, if you like this episode, please subscribe. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating and share with your friends.
You can also sign up for the ByrdAdatto newsletter by going to our website at ByrdAdatto.com.
ByrdAdatto is providing this podcast as a public service. This podcast is for educational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute legal advice, nor does it establish an attorney-client relationship. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by ByrdAdatto. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Please consult with an attorney on your legal issues.